Before we get started, a quick reminder. The Crime Shack is listener supported. If you'd like to help us keep telling these stories, you'll find the support link in the show notes or at thecrimeshack.com. The Crime Shack exists because of listeners like you. Your support makes each episode possible. Check out the link in the show notes or visit thecrimeshack.com to join our community. This podcast contains content that may not be suitable for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Hey friends, welcome back. I'm Michelle Pense, and this is the Crime Shack podcast. Before we dive in, hit follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps the show grow and reach more listeners like yourself. You can support the podcast through my website, thecrimeshack.com, and be sure to follow me on socials for new case drops and updates. On a desolate stretch of farmland outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, a boy learned two lessons that would shape his twisted world: that life was corrupt and that women were the root of that corruption. His name was Ed Gein. Before his story became legend, before the streaming shows and the movies, it was just loneliness, devotion, and a house where love rotted into worship, and worship decayed into horror. Today we're going to ask a hard question. What bends a mind until it tries to crawl back into the skin of the person it can't let go? How does ordinary loneliness slide toward delusion, and delusion toward desecration and murder? We'll trace the path from a strict mother and a failing farm to a locked shed in November 1957, where a deputy opened a door and found a hanging human body. You'll hear the documented facts, the interview admissions, and the courtroom outcome that define the case. We'll separate the myths from the actual investigation. And at the end, we'll talk about why Ed Gein's crimes that happened over 70 years ago still haunts our culture today, and why we keep looking, even when we want to look away. Edward Theodore Gein was born August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He had an older brother, Henry George Gein, who was born in January 1901. Their father, George, was a violent alcoholic, and their mother, Augusta, was a strict and devout Protestant Lutheran. Because of his alcoholism, George struggled to keep steady work because he was unreliable. At various times, he worked as a carpenter, tanner, and insurance salesman. His drinking often led to physical fights with Augusta, who despised him and constantly berated him in front of their sons. Augusta followed the Missouri Synod Lutheran tradition specifically, one of the most conservative branches of Lutheranism in the United States. Her morals were rigid and fixed. She believed alcohol, sex, women, other than herself, were corrupting influences. This wasn't the standard Lutheran teaching. It was her personal extreme interpretation, but she justified it through scripture. She used her faith as a tool of dominance over her husband and sons, preaching that the world was full of sinners and that only through strict moral living could they avoid eternal damnation. The family moved to a small farm near Plainfield, Wisconsin, and to further protect her family from the immorality of the outside world, she strove to isolate them, rarely letting the boys interact socially. School for Ed was brief and lonely. Classmates remembered a quiet, odd boy. There were no real friendships, no girlfriends, and almost no social life. George Gein's alcohol addiction took its toll. His health declined, and he became weak, unemployed, and drank heavily on a daily basis. He ultimately died from heart failure in April 1940 at the age of 66. After George's death, the small family's already fragile structure completely broke. Henry and Ed began taking on odd jobs, mainly handyman work and farm labor, to support Augusta and keep the small farm property running. But it also meant Augusta's control over the household tightened even more, with no one left to counter her religious dominance. She would tell her sons that the world is evil and that women were filthy by nature and were instruments of the devil. If Ed mentioned a woman in town, she'd launch into fiery sermons about whores and immoral women and warn the boys that sexual desire was wicked and would lead them straight to hell. She rarely, if ever, showed physical affection. No hugging, no comforting touch. Psychiatric records note that Ed could not even recall his mother ever holding or consoling him, even when he was a child. If she would show affection, she would use it to further her control. She would give or deny affection depending on how obedient and pure her sons behaved. When Ed or Henry followed her rules, read the Bible, prayed, avoided social contact, she might show a flicker of warmth or call them good boys. The boys were taught that love was something to be earned through moral purity or through suppression of oneself, not freely given. If the boys disappointed her, even in trivial ways, she would go silent for hours or days, forcing them to grovel for forgiveness. Her approval became conditional and unpredictable, which is one of the classic hallmarks of emotional abuse. It created in Ed a deep craving to please her, combined with constant anxiety that he was failing her. She would force Ed and Henry to sit and listen to her read the King James Bible for hours, specifically focusing on stories and chapters on divine wrath and judgment. Verses like Proverbs 5 that states, quote, "Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell." Or passages from the book of Revelation, which talks about the whore of Babylon, symbolizing moral decay. She would use constant shaming language to control both sons emotionally. If Ed looked at a woman or showed curiosity, she would scold him, tell him that women spread disease, and called him weak, filthy, or corrupted. She told him that the only person he could ever trust was her, reinforcing his deep emotional dependency on her. When the family would witness people in the town cursing, drinking, or going to dances, Augusta referred to them as sinners, heathens, or the damned. Their neighbors would later tell investigators that Augusta's tirades could be heard from outside the farmhouse. One neighbor said that she would preach and rant for hours, her voice rising in anger while the boys sat in silence. The neighbors witnessed, and Ed also testified later on, that Augusta would slap, shake, or strike her sons when they disobeyed her or used sinful language. Augusta would often warn her sons that God's judgment was near, and anyone who sinned, especially women who tempted men, would be punished by death or disease. She also believed that her role was to save her sons from eternal damnation, a twisted justification for her domination. As horrific as the emotional and psychological domination was, there is no credible evidence that Augusta ever had a sexual or incestuous relationship with either of her sons. Her sustained manipulation and control created a toxic dependency. Ed viewed Augusta as both a savior and a punisher. In addition, the long Bible readings left Ed terrified of women, but also subconsciously fixated on them. It's this duality that would later drive him to psychosis. It's also part of the reason why, as an adult, Ed could not form normal emotional or sexual attachments. Love to him was synonymous with fear, submission, and shame. Psychiatrists would later describe Augusta as exhibiting traits of narcissistic and paranoid personality disorder with strong religious delusions, believing she alone was righteous and everyone else was bound for hell. That belief justified her control over her son's every thought and behavior. The result of this chaotic upbringing was that Ed grew up in a near-total emotional vacuum. No empathy, no affection, and a worldview where love was fused with domination and guilt. As the Gein brothers grew up, Henry pushed back against Augusta's control and would criticize her around Ed, saying she was too controlling and that Ed's attachment to her was not healthy. Henry's obvious displeasure and disagreement of the relationship between Ed and his mother caused Ed to resent Henry's comments as he idolized Augusta and felt protective of her. In May 1944, the brothers were burning brush on their property when the fire spread. After the blaze was controlled, Ed reported Henry missing. Authorities later found 43-year-old Henry's body lying face down, dead. Although he had bruises on his head, the death was ruled accidental. An autopsy was not performed, and the sheriff accepted 37-year-old Ed's version of events. After Henry's death, Ed lived alone with his mother until she died the following year in December 1945. This event created a physical detachment for 39-year-old Ed, but also a devastating emotional loss that completely triggered his later descent. When Augusta Gein died, something inside Ed broke and never got repaired. He was emotionally stunted and now completely alone in a world his mother had taught him to fear. After her funeral, Ed sealed her bedroom and parlor shut, locking away her furniture, her Bible, even the smell of her perfume, as if preserving her ghost. Those rooms would stay untouched for years, preserved like a shrine, while the rest of the house slowly became a hoarder's haven and rotted into filth. Ed moved into a tiny room near the kitchen, sleeping beside a wood stove surrounded by trash, old newspapers, and discarded food. Neighbors who stopped by recalled the disgusting stench and the darkness, and recalled Ed standing in the middle of it, quiet, polite, and strangely detached. To make any amount of money he could, he picked up handyman jobs around Plainfield, mending fences, fixing machinery, and sometimes babysitting for local families. People thought he was harmless, but definitely odd. He was kind. He never cursed, never drank, and never seemed angry. Just lonely. But behind the isolation, his mind was beginning to unravel. He'd spend hours reading pulp magazines and crime digests, stories about cannibals, Nazi experiments, and medical dissection. A pulp magazine was a periodical printed on cheap wood pulp paper, popular in the 1950s, and featured genre fiction such as westerns, detective stories, science fiction, and romance. He collected anatomy books and newspaper clippings about women who had died violently. He told investigators later that he found comfort in those stories because death, in a way, was something he thoroughly understood. He also started attending local funerals, especially of middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. He'd sit quietly near the back, watching, absorbing the ritual, then go home to his empty farmhouse. Before we get to the rest of the story, I wanted to let you know that your support doesn't just keep the show going. It helps uncover stories that might otherwise stay hidden. Find the link in the show notes or at thecrimeshack.com. Sometime between 1947 and 1949, Ed's curiosity crossed the line into compulsion. When attending random strangers' funerals was no longer enough, he began visiting cemeteries at night, often in what he later described as a trance-like state. He would dig up recently buried women, take what he wanted, and then, after feeling an immense amount of guilt, sometimes place what was left back and fill the graves again. It was from these stolen bodies that he began experimenting, preserving the human skin, tanning it, shaping it. A mask here, a lampshade there. The early beginnings of what would later become known as his woman's suit. Psychiatrists would later describe this period as a slow descent into psychosis, a place where grief, guilt, and fantasy merged into one. Through it all, Ed never dated, never even touched another living person intimately in his life. He would later tell doctors that he had never been with a woman, and that the thought of sex both disgusted and fascinated him. Every woman he met seemed to carry his mother's shadow, something to be worshipped but never touched. By the early 1950s, Ed was living in two worlds, one where he fixed fences and lent a hand around town, and another hidden world of silence and decay, one where he played God among the dead. The people of Plainfield saw a quiet, strange man who minded his own business. They had no idea that behind the locked doors of that farmhouse, Ed's loneliness was transforming into something unspeakable. On the evening of December 8, 1954, 51-year-old Mary Hogan, the tough, sharp-tongued owner of Mary's Tavern in nearby Pine Grove, vanished without a trace. When customers came to the tavern the next morning, they found blood smeared across the tavern floor, a single spent .32 caliber shell casing near the counter, and Mary's purse lying open behind the bar. The cash register was empty, but Mary was gone. To those who knew her, Mary Hogan was larger than life. She was chatty, flirtatious, and unapologetically bold. She cursed, she laughed loudly, and ran her tavern with the kind of confidence that Augusta, Ed's mother, would have called sinful. For years, Ed had been an unassuming, quiet fixture around Plainfield. He was only seen as the handyman who helped neighbors, the soft-spoken man who mowed lawns and patched roofs. But after Mary disappeared, people noticed something strange in the way he talked about her. At the general store or sitting in the local diner, Ed would sometimes grin and say, quote, "Mary Hogan isn't missing. She's over at my house right now." The words were so bizarre that people thought he was joking and laughed them off as another one of Ed's odd jokes. What no one in Plainfield realized was that Mary Hogan had become the living embodiment of the women Augusta had warned him about. She was vulgar, worldly, independent, the kind of woman Ed both feared and desired. And in his broken mind, that mix of disgust and fascination needed an outlet. Investigators would later piece together what happened that night. Mary was closing up the tavern when Ed walked in, carrying a small caliber pistol. He shot her once in the head, and she died instantly. He then dragged her body out the back door of the tavern, loaded it into his truck, and drove the 10 miles back to his isolated farmhouse. For the next 3 years, no one saw or heard from Mary Hogan again. Her disappearance became a town mystery, a missing person story that eventually faded into the background, overshadowed by hunting season and the harsh Wisconsin winters. But Ed knew exactly where Mary was. Saturday, November 16, 1957. It was almost 3 years after Mary Hogan had disappeared. Inside Warden's Hardware on Main Street, 58-year-old Bernice Warden clicked on the lights, counted the money in the cash register, and wrote down the day's first sale across a carbon pad of paper. It was deer hunting season, and outside, trucks idled and men in bright orange made their way towards the woods. By late afternoon, Bernice's son, Frank Warden, who was a deputy sheriff in town, was dropping by his mother's hardware store to say hello. He pushed through the door and stopped. The shop was too still, too quiet. The cash register drawer hung open. A ribbon of blood trailed from behind the counter across the worn wood plank floor toward the back. But there was no sign of a struggle. There was no shattered glass, no toppled over shelves, just the blood, and Bernice was gone. Frank's training and his worst fear arrived together. He swept through the store, called it into the department, then went to the sales pad near the register, the carbon slip that he knew Bernice had always used. The last entry that morning was in her neat handwriting. 1 gallon of antifreeze, and the customer's name, Ed Gein. Deputies fanned out, and it wasn't difficult to locate the quiet, strange handyman known around town. Authorities located Ed that evening and brought him in. While investigators questioned him, a team headed for his farm on the edge of town. The sagging farmhouse with the windows clouded in dirt and grime, and the yard scattered with rusting odds and ends. They split up, 1 unit to the house, 1 to the outbuildings. A deputy swung open the shed door. His flashlight beam caught on something pale, something hanging from the rafter. For a second, his mind refused to process it. Then it clicked. A human body, headless, was strung upside down from a crossbar. The body's ankles were tied with rope and connected to the crossbar. The torso had been split from in between the legs to the top of the chest and had been gutted and dressed out like a deer. The body was Bernice Warden. A gunshot had taken her life. Everything after that occurred post-mortem. The unit that entered the farmhouse discovered an entirely different set of horrors. The air inside the house was stale, sweet, metallic. Rooms were jammed with newspapers, food tins, and junk stacked to the ceiling. Investigators moved slowly, cataloging everything as they went. In the kitchen, in the bedroom, and in boxes under the bed, they began to find the items that would shock the country. Human skulls, some fully intact, and some cut in half and used as bowls. Masks made out of human faces, carefully flayed and preserved. Lamps and chairs that had been stitched together from human skin. A vest-like woman's torso designed to be laced on and worn. Various household objects with human remains incorporated into them. preserved organs and bones, labeled in boxes or meticulously arranged. Step by step, investigators gathered the pieces to the puzzle. The antifreeze sale, the blood in the hardware store, the body hanging in the shed, and the inside of the farmhouse that was a museum of grief turned into horrific ritual. As they pushed deeper into the rooms, the case against Gein widened beyond Bernice Worden. Investigators also recovered remains linked to Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who disappeared in 1954. Mary's face was discovered inside a paper bag. It had been carefully shaved off of her head. The skin was tanned, preserved, and grotesquely fashioned into a mask, identified through scar patterns as hers. With this find, and Gein's later admission to shooting her, saying that, quote, she talked too much, Mary's disappearance stopped being a rumor and became a second documented homicide. Ed had been arrested and taken back to the sheriff's office. He was calm and courteous. He offered no emotion and no remorse, just a flat, empty, affectless voice that the officers would come to know well. He acknowledged shooting Bernice Worden with a .22 and later admitted he had done the same to Mary Hogan in 1954. When the questions turned to the objects found in his house, he told them about the visits to the cemeteries, how he would read the obituaries, then he would go out at night and dig. He told them he targeted women who resembled his mother. From Ed's own account, investigators derived a timeline for what occurred at the hardware store. During the morning rush, Bernice had filled that antifreeze order, and she wrote Ed's name on the slip because that's what she did for every sale. There was no evidence of defensive injuries in the store, no signs of a struggle, just the open cash register drawer and the blood trail to the rear door. The shed told the rest. Deputies continued to work the scene at the farmhouse through the night, rotating in and out to breathe and take breaks before going back in. The evidence team measured, photographed, bagged, and recorded every single item. Every connection to a known missing person or grave was checked. This wasn't just a house of horrors. It was a crime scene. The objects inside were not legends. They were evidence. They established a pattern that matched Ed's statements. Years of grave robbing, then, when winter made the ground too hard to dig, he resorted to murder. When morning came, the farm looked the same as it did from the road. The leaning porch, the flat fields. But inside, nothing would ever be the same. Back in custody, Ed Gein talked. He admitted to killing Worden and to shooting Mary Hogan in 1954. He detailed the grave robberies, slipping into cemeteries at night, prying open graves, taking what he wanted, which was mostly heads and sex organs, and in some cases returning some items to the caskets. He described a compulsion to become his mother, crafting a skin suit as a way to inhabit the woman that he had idolized. Then a complication arose. Sheriff Art Schle's rough treatment during interrogation led a judge to throw out an early confession as inadmissible. However, it didn't end the case. The physical evidence did not depend on that statement, but it did shape how the trial would proceed a decade later. Ed's explanations and statements included incidents of brief amnesia and the shooting of Worden being an accident. He would fluctuate between memories of what had happened and complete denial in other moments. He described being in a haze, then coming to back at his house, and then realizing what he was doing was wrong. But he was very clear on this one fact, that winter made grave digging impossible. And that's when he turned to murder. If you'd like to hear Ed's real voice, the actual police interview is currently available on the internet. MGM Plus had obtained the rights to the recording for their show Psycho, The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein. Unfortunately, due to copyright issues, I'm unable to include the actual audio of that recording in this podcast. On November 21st, 1957, Ed Gein was formally charged with a single count of first-degree murder for the killing of Bernice Worden. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity and was sent for a psychiatric evaluation. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and judged him incompetent for trial. Ed was then committed to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, but later transferred to Mendota State Hospital, now called Mendota Mental Health Institute, the state psychiatric hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. In 1968, doctors found him mentally able to assist in his defense. The case went forward as a bench trial, but no jury, and it was decided by Judge Robert H. Golmar. After a week of testimony, Golmar found Ed Gein guilty of Worden's murder, then immediately held a separate sanity phase. Following medical testimony, he ruled Gein not guilty by reason of insanity and recommitted him. Because of the cost and the previous psychiatric ruling, the state never tried him for Mary Hogan, even though his admission stood. He would never leave state custody again. As the legal process moved forward, an auction was scheduled in March 1958 for the Gein farm and its contents. 10 days before the sale, the farmhouse mysteriously burned down. Arson rumors spread, but a definitive cause was never proven. The site became just an open field, the macabre house existing only in photos. Gein's car, a 1949 Ford, was sold to a carnival showman and toured as a roadside attraction. Back inside the Mendota State Hospital, Ed Gein lived a quiet, compliant life. He gardened, he assisted staff, he remained medicated and contained. He died on July 26, 1984, from respiratory failure due to cancer at age 77, and was buried in Plainfield Cemetery near his mother and brother. The headstone became a target for vandals, and in 2000 it was stolen outright. His grave remains unmarked today. You don't have to read a police report to know this story. You've seen echoes of it on screen. Every few years, a new documentary or series repurposes Ed Gein's crimes for a fresh new audience. Psycho borrows the mother fixation. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre borrows the human mask. And Silence of the Lambs borrows the woman's suit. These works aren't biographies, they're cultural echoes. New movies and shows keep the echo alive, but some also love to add additional elements that never existed. But the record doesn't budge and the truth doesn't change. 2 confessed murders, extensive grave desecrations, and a cataloged interior that documented one man's ritualized grief. We look at people like Ed Gein because he shatters the things we want to believe are sacred. The quiet of a small town, the safety of our dead, the border between grief and obsession. It's natural to feel a flicker of pity for a boy raised in a household filled with fear and emotional guilt. But pity turns dangerous when it erases the women he destroyed. A shopkeeper opening up on a winter morning, a tavern owner locking up for the night, and a community that still carries what was found in that shed and in that house. These aren't ghost stories. They are real names, real people, real addresses, and real evidence tags. Ed Gein made choices in his life. He chose worship over mourning, desecration over remembrance, and murder when the ground froze and graves would not open. He wrapped himself in a fantasy of becoming his mother and fed his loneliness with control. The system made a choice too, to name his illness, to strip away the legend, and to remove him from the world that he harmed. And that is where Ed's story ends. Not in myth, but in accountability, containment, and the memory of the victims that must outlast the monster. That's it, friends. Thank you for joining me. Head over to thecrimeshack.com and check out my new website where you can find all my episodes and ways you as a listener can help support the show. Be sure to connect with me on social media and subscribe to my podcast on whatever platform you listen to your podcasts so you don't miss the next episode. Until next time, stay safe, everyone. Every episode we make is fueled by listener support. If you'd like to help us create more, you'll find the link in the show notes or at thecrimeshack.com.